Hi, boys and girls. It's Mrs. Martin. I'm going to be sharing this video with you on teaching and reviewing the elements of fiction terms when you are reading a fictional story. When you read a fictional story, you know that the events in a story follow a certain pattern, a certain series of events. So we're going to go over those terms today. When you're in your digital notebook, you're going to see there's a link to a Plot Mountain Prezi, which is just a fancy presentation that I'm going to go over with you today. There is a sort, which is going to take you to a Google drawing where you can sort the names of the events. And there's also a Quizlet link. You're going to see in the next slide in your digital notebook all the terms that we're going to be learning throughout this plot unit and reviewing, as well as a plot diagram, or we also sometimes call it a plot mountain because it does look like a mountain as you go up and you go down. So when we go to this Prezi that you can access at any time, it looks like this. You're going to see that it is kind of in the shape of this mountain, or the plot diagram that we call it. And the reason why we call it that is because in a fictional story, it follows a series of events that are told in a specific order. So as we start, I'm going to kind of compare, as we review these terms, the story to a hike, to climbing a mountain. So if you've ever climbed a mountain, you're going to remember that when you first started, you're kind of taking the scenery in, getting used to the atmosphere. What is the weather like? You know, where are you at? When is this? Is it in the morning, in the late afternoon? Who are you with? Like, what company are you sharing? Same thing when you start reading a story. When you start reading a story, you learn about who the characters are in the story, where and when the story is taking place, the setting. You're getting some basic background information. This is called the exposition. It's just a fancy word for the introduction that you may have already be familiar with. Also, when you start reading a story, there's going to be some incident, some event that kind of sets the story going. So as you're climbing that mountain, it's that those first few steps as you're really getting into the hike when you're climbing the mountain. This is the part of the story that makes the rest of the story possible, kind of like in the story Finding Nemo. Tragically, in Finding Nemo, in the very beginning of the story, the first event, the inciting incident, the event that gets the story started, unfortunately, in the story Finding Nemo, Nemo and his other brothers and sisters are little baby eggs waiting to be born. And there's this really, really large fish that attacks and eats all of the eggs and Nemo's mother. And so you find out that during this terrible incident in his life that, you know, he's a little bit injured. So when he is born, all the events that follow that, his dad is super protective of him. He has that little limp fin that propels the rest of the story to take place. And that's why things continue to happen in that story the way that they do, because of that very first incident in the story. And that what sets the story into motion so that the rest of the story is possible. And that's called the inciting incident. That happens in the very, very beginning of the story. But then as we continue reading the story, this is where most of the story is taking place, also where most of our hike is taking place. You know, when you've hiked a mountain, that most of your hike is taking place with you climbing that mountain. You're having fun, you're enjoying your company, but you might also trip. You might skin a knee, you might see a snake. There's lots of things that can kind of go wrong that moves the story along or that moves you up the mountain. Same thing within a story. This is where most of the events of the story take place. This is where the complications happen, the conflicts happen, where things aren't necessarily going right. There's a problem that needs to be solved, and these characters are trying to figure out how to do that. And that is called the rising action because the action is rising. It is building in the story. And it's building and building and building to the climax of the story. So just like when you climb a mountain, when you get to the top, you're so pumped, you're excited that you're at the top of the mountain. You can enjoy the view. Same thing in a story. The climax usually is the